Now, a reminder on that Chapter 9 fabric discussion we had. We were talking about length of grain and cross grain. So on this fabric, we're going to pretend that these lines can give us a little bit of that idea. That the length of grain, if we pull on it, it's not going to have a whole lot of strength. And the cross grain, same idea, right? But if I were to pull on the diagonal, can you see how that stretches? So on the diagonal or on the bias, fabric is inherently stretchy. Because when we're pulling on our cross grain or on our length of grain, we're pulling on just those threads, right? Those straight threads that got wove together. Whereas on the diagonal, we're not pulling on any straight line, and that's why fabric will do that. So we're going to use this 10 by 10 inch square to make bias tape. And step 1 is going to be to mark some lines that we'll cut it on in order to assemble it back together. So using a 2-inch ruler from cupboard number 2, your little ones from your kits won't do this one for you. I'm lining up my ruler so that I'm going end to end. Right now, as a perfectly square piece of fabric, I know that my 45-degree angle is right when it comes to lining it up on those corners. So step 1 is just drawing these lines, making sure that you're holding your ruler nice and steady while you do so. So I made a little mistake, so I'm just going to cross that line out just right there in the corner, and I'll be using the bottom line. Now we're going to make 2-inch wide bias tape, and that so happens to be the width of this ruler. So one of the best things about these rulers is that you can use them, just like your baby ones, as a way to mark incrementations. So as a 2-inch wide ruler, if I put one end on my existing line, I can draw 2 inches away. If I wanted a 1-inch wide strip, I would just center my ruler on that line and then draw on this side, and I would get 1 inches. So we're going to make 2-inch wide strips. So now that I have my lines marked, I'll be basically making 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces to make into my bias tape. I'm not going to use this section right here, and I'm not going to use that section right there. So right now we have our cut pieces, and the next step will be to cut these into all the same exact shape. Right now they all look like trapezoids, right? We have one side that's longer and one side that's shorter, with lines that flute outwards. And we need to make these into parallelograms, which will basically become this shape, this slanty sideways rectangle. But in order to make sure that we have 4 mirrored pieces or similar pieces, we're going to treat this pair together and this pair together, because we basically have to trim opposite ends in order to make sure that they become the same shape of piece. So using our ruler, we're going to echo the line of the angle on one side to create that shape of a parallelogram. So if you take this line right here, and we can actually follow this stripe of the fabric, and you're going to go up your fabric piece until you see that the stripes aren't going all the way across. So you see how right now the stripe is continuing the full 2 inches, and then right here that stripe stops. So actually this is where, on this line, we're going to trim this parallelogram, and you can either draw the line or just use the line of the fabric. And then we're creating these angled geometric shapes. So we're going to do the same thing right here. Watch your pattern, and then you can see how right at the end of this red stripe, the pattern starts to taper away into that triangle. We're basically cutting off that triangle. So we're going to cut off that triangle. Now, if we were just to keep on going on this side, the problem that we're going to have is that when we get to later on steps, they're not going to line up properly. So we've cut off this end on this pair. We need to cut off this end on this pair. So same technique applies. Follow the pattern, and then you see right here on the orange line, that's where it stops filling in the full shape of the fabric. So I'm going to cut that, and that's going to become the end point of my parallelogram. This is easier to visualize with pattern, but if you don't have a striped fabric, basically you can also plot your points. So this is a different method of doing what I just showed you. You measure the shorter end of your parallelogram. This one measures 10 inches. So I take 10 inches because I know that's how long this side will be, and then starting on the other end, I'll line up my ruler and I'll find where 10 inches is, and that'll be right here on the end of that stripe. So that's another way that you can do it. And then I'll just put an X there. The reason why I'm putting X's, and I'll cut it off in a second, is I wanted you guys to visualize what I mean by mirroring. We're cutting off the ends on this side and then the ends on this side. So then that way when we're done, no matter which way we move these pieces, they will always be the same directionality. All right. And that's how you'll prep the 4 pieces that you'll be using for your bias tape. So now we have to pin this together to make up our bias tape. So we have our 4 pieces, and I'm just going to work with 2 to start. But basically we want to make sure that we do it just like a plain seam. So you have your right sides together, and then you have to lay them together so that your right sides are touching and your seam allowances are lined up. So right now my seam allowances are pointing to the same edge. And if I were to peel this back, you would see my right sides together. All right, and then that'll become the goal for how we stitch this. If you're ever uncertain about how things are supposed to go, you can lay your pieces in the way that they're meant to. So I have my right sides together, and eventually I know these 2 edges are supposed to line up, and they're supposed to fold over to each other, and they're supposed to then get stitched. So I can see that it's happening, so how do I pinch them together in a way that makes me understand how they get sewn? So if I can line those up and then flip one right on that axis, that's how you can help remind yourself of how your layers are supposed to go together. So if you look in your binder, you'll actually see this image of the wrong side of the fabric, the right side of the fabric, and the next piece will get laid in place with the wrong side of the fabric facing you and the right side on the next one. So look in your binder and you'll be able to see this kind of V-shaped image. But when we go to pin these together, your brains might be like, make it neat. Make sure that you pin and make sure that your edges are under, but you're not accounting in for seam allowance. So I'm going to pin this. Now make a note, don't do this. But if I pin this how it will be sewn, so right now I'm just doing a parallel line, and then I fold this open, can you see how that's super jiggity jaggedy? Right? That's because when we sewed it, the seam allowance ate up some of the size of our fabric. So we have to account for that. So when you line up your fabrics, you're going to overshoot your seam allowances or your points, because eventually we'll be stitching right in this line, right where they intersect. So if I pin this as if it's sewn so you guys can visualize, you see how when I fold it open, it makes a nice straight line right here on the edge? That's because the seam allowance has been accounted for. All right, so back to step 5. Once you've laid your fabric pieces so that your right side is touching your other right side, and the seam allowances are lined up on one edge, and your little triangles are overshot by about a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch, You're then going to pin perpendicularly. And it won't matter which way your pin heads are going, whatever's easier for you to take out later on. And we're going to pin our ends, and then you guessed it, we're going to pin our centers. And then that way this piece is ready for the machine. Now you can choose to pin and then sew, or you can prep all of your pieces at once. Now sitting down at your machine, making sure that your zigzag is at 0 and that your stitch length is at 3. You're ready to stitch your bias. Now, like any other plain seam, I'm going to line up my bias tape with the presser foot, only this time I'll be looking to line up. You see where those two fabrics intersect? That little V? That V is where I want to line up with the cut on my presser foot. And so I'll be relatively close to the edge. I won't backstitch to start because on bias it tends to have the elasticity of the fabric, makes it hard for it to stay put, but I will still hold my threads when I start. So in this case, that little V where the fabrics intersect, where the seam allowance overlap, is about a 1/4 inch from the edge, so I'm also able to line up the edge, the side edge here of my presser foot. And then the last step to doing our bias is just to press this seam open for each of your 3 seams. So you kind of open that up and then get the iron in. You'll press it nice and flat and open. And then with your scissors, you'll trim off the thread tails and those extra little triangles of seam allowance so that you can create a nice even edge. And if you have a little bit of unevenness from when you pieced these sections together, just keep in mind that half of this is going to become seam allowance. So that if we were using this to make a double fold, we would fold our piece in half, and then we would fold each end in to meet that center fold. And if you remember from the blue that we used in Chapter 6, Seam Finishes, there's a little bit of distance or difference in width between the top and the bottom. But that's how we would make double fold bias that ends up being a 1/2 inch finished from a 2 inch wide piece.